Hello class, I am talking to you today about how to better understand logical arguments and logical fallacies. And so as far as the details of what we'll be doing as far as the assignment and or final exam, I'll talk about those by way of a screencast and take it from there. So what I'll do now is just focus on the details of how to understand logical arguments and logical fallacies, at least at just a general level, just to warm up, because the way in which we're thinking about these ideas, especially in terms of logic, is something that we could really spend the entire semester on. So we're really just touching on the topics and taking it from there. So first of all, when we're looking at how it is that we're understanding reasoning, one of the things that we want to recognize is the way in which we're understanding logic as synonymous with how it is that we're reasoning. And something that I'm always pointing out as far as reasoning is along with the understanding that we're seeing reasoning as structural and organizational in terms of our thinking. So in other words, when we're thinking rationally, we're also taking into account how it is that we're structuring our ideas and the components and details of the points that we're making, the conclusions that we're drawing, so on and so forth. And so just right off the top, we have this word argument, and the word argument usually in everyday thinking has to do with how it is that we're in disagreement with someone for some reason. And in this case, at least as far as a more technical understanding of it in light of just introduction to philosophy, we're really just looking at an argument as a way to propose an idea. In other words, an argument could be a proposition. It's also a way in which we are drawing a conclusion that is backed up by way of premises. So when you really look at it, it's really a little more anodyne than just arguing with someone or fighting over something as we normally look at it in everyday recognition. So we'll get started with what we refer to as a deductive argument. So the premises of a deductive argument are proof or support of a conclusion, right? And so one thing we're getting clear there is that premises are ways in which we're thinking about evidence that we're proposing to bring about a conclusion, or evidence that we're bringing in our statements in order to draw a conclusion about whatever it is that we're concluding, whatever sort of proposition or induction that we're bringing about. So the premises of a deductive argument are proof or support of a conclusion if in every possible situation in which the premises are true, the conclusion also must be true. And so you want to pay close attention to what I just pointed out there in terms of every possible situation or in all situations. So in that sense, we're looking at a deductive argument as a way in which we're covering all cases. And so also too, when we're drawing conclusions that have to do with all cases, that sort of thing, we could also then reverse that to say no case or absolutely none. So in that sense, we're always at least paying attention to negation as well, that is hovering in the background or seen as a feature of our knowledge. Usually when we're thinking about logic, we tend to focus on the positive as opposed to the negation. But still, without getting too distracted, we're also seeing the way in which the way we use reasoning is also an indication of how it is that we're understanding things in terms of these all-encompassing points in relation to a deductive argument. Okay, so in other words, a characteristic of a deductive argument has to do with the way in which we're including all cases, and then likewise no cases as well. Okay. And then a deductive argument is valid when in every possible situation in which the premises are true, its conclusion must also be true. The premises, so let's repeat that. So a deductive argument is valid when in every possible situation in which the premises are true, our conclusion must also be true. Okay. And then the premises and conclusion of a valid argument do not have to be true. In other words, the basic structure of the argument is a way in which we are understanding an argument that is valid. If a deductive argument is not valid, then the argument is not sound. An argument that is both valid and has true premises is known as a sound argument. So again, the reflection there is also on this idea that logic is formal. And so, in other words, when we're thinking logically, we're only thinking about how everything is organized, but yet at the same time, we see that the way in which things are organized is also a way in which we rely on premises that fall out of, that are a part of that structure. So if a deductive argument is not valid, then the argument is not sound. An argument that is both valid and has true premises is known as a sound argument. So remember that the conditions for this line of argumentation are more stringent than with an inductive argument, of which we'll talk about in just a second, since an inductive argument only is an argument for what is probable. So in other words, an inductive argument is probabilistic, whereas a deductive argument is a way in which we're accounting for all cases. And then, as I've been pointing out, also that can mean absolutely no cases as well. And so since an inductive argument is only an argument for what is probable. And so a deductive argument usually is logically and structurally organized from the general to the specific. In other words, you're making a general observation about something in order to make a specific point or to draw a specific conclusion. So what I'm also going to do when I'm talking about it here on video is I'm not going to include the reference to the formal notation that I have for the arguments, and you'll see that highlighted in the PDF that I'm including in blue. Okay, so the blue formal arguments are really to help you see the structure of the argument in order to make your the way in which you're bringing an example a little easier to isolate. Okay, so an example of a deductive argument is a classic one that I'm quoting. So the example is, the first premise is Socrates is a man. The second premise is all men are mortal. And the conclusion is, therefore, Socrates is mortal. So you're seeing how it is that you're going from a general understanding to a specific example. And the specific example is that Socrates is mortal. And now to an inductive argument. So an inductive argument is a probable argument whereby the premises are claims about what is true in some cases, not all cases. And that could also be most cases as well. And so in other words, not all cases, as would be the case with a deductive argument. So the conclusion of an inductive argument is a claim about what will be true in similar cases. An inductive argument is a strong argument if the premises that support the conclusion are very probable. So it's strong if the premises are probable. And so again, you're remembering that the premises are what the argument, what you're relying on when you're making an argument. And we're seeing that the arguments, the strength of your argument really has to do with the strength of your premises. The strength of your conclusion, likewise, really has to do with the strength of your argument, whether that's an inductive argument or really any argument. And so an inductive argument is a strong argument if the premises that support the conclusion are very probable, and it is a weak argument if they do not. An inductive argument usually is an argument structured from a specific, in other words, a sample of whatever it is that you're concluding, to a general or a generalized conclusion having to do with just an overall grouping. How the details relate to the larger whole in your conclusion. So the example is premise 1, some trees flower in the spring. Premise 2, and some trees are blooming now. And then the conclusion is, yet not all trees are flowering or blooming now. So in other words, there we also have negation as well. But don't get too distracted with that, because all we're really pointing out too is that underneath all of the points that I'm making here too, we could also just have basic negation in terms of we're not always aiming for establishing the truth in a positive sense. We could also be showing how something or some things are not the case. So always remember that when we're thinking about the truth, whenever it is that we're working to establish a point on the truth, we could also be working on establishing the point that something is not the case as well. So that's kind of like a complication there that you want to take into account. And so when we look at our argument, we're including negation in there to understand how this is working for an inductive argument as well. But it's not restricted to negation, because you could always be making a positive claim about something. Okay, and then lastly, as far as just logical arguments in general, we also have, and we're not limited to these options because there's even more, but again, this is just an introduction to logical argumentation. We have what's called an abductive argument. So an abductive argument is another way of referring to an argument from the best explanation. So this type of argument is identified as a way to draw a conclusion without all the information intended in the premises. In other words, an abductive argument is made even when there is not 100% certainty of the premises. So that's an argument whereby we don't have all of the evidence, but yet we still have a theoretical way in which we're drawing a conclusion from premises whereby the premises have an incomplete aspect. One of the ways we understand that is something like Darwin's theory of evolution. So Darwin's theory of evolution is a way in which we're working on a theory of how it is that we evolved as human beings, and there's missing parts to it, but yet at the same time it's accepted as a way in which we're understanding the evolution of humankind on Earth. And I don't have an argument for that because I'm not having you work on that. Okay, and so now we step into logical fallacies, which are always interesting. And so logical fallacies are obviously related to mistakes with our reasoning. These claims, and also to, these claims are frighteningly common. We make use of them more than we should, and essentially the structure of a logical fallacy is a way in which we rely on problematic, uninvestigated, mistaken, hasty, ignorant, immoral, or other such troublesome reasoning, often in the name of drawing a conclusion about something that is hastily assumed to be true or false. Again, oftentimes when we're thinking about any of these types of argumentation, we're working at establishing some kind of truth. While at the same time, with logical fallacies, we see that we're calling into question the truth that's claimed. But at the same time, it's not always a positive truth. It could also be a way of showing how something is wrong. In other words, you could show how something is wrong and get how it is that you're showing something is wrong incorrect. Okay, and so remember too that you're not always showing something is true. Anything that is true in our examples is easily replaced with false claims. In other words, you can make false claims, and there could be a way in which we're understanding that in terms of logical fallacies as well. Okay, so hopefully that doesn't complicate it any more than we need to. Okay, so our first example of a logical fallacy is a non sequitur. And this is also understood as affirming the consequent. The words non sequitur in Latin mean it does not follow. So non sequitur means it doesn't follow. And basically this type of faulty reason, this is a type of faulty reasoning whereby the conclusion is not easily the result of the premises. In other words, someone offers a conclusion that is backed up by questionable premises. Again, we have that way in which we're looking at the premises to begin with, the evidence that's brought forth, and calling into question the premises in order to show the problem with the conclusion. Okay, so it's all, the devil is in the premises really when we're looking at argumentation. And so we have an example. The first premise, I worked on this assignment for 5 hours, so I deserve a good grade for this assignment. Second premise is, I did not get a good grade for this assignment. And the conclusion then is, it is unfair that I did not get a good grade on this assignment, and the implication is, it's unfair because I did all this work on the assignment. I didn't get the grade I wanted. But we have to remember that the problem with that thinking is that just because you work hard on something doesn't necessarily mean that you're understanding it. And so this is common, especially in my online classes. I've heard this before. I've worked 8 hours on this assignment, so I should get a good grade. But you could be working on it 8 hours and not understanding it. And so therefore, it's not necessary that you get a good grade. Okay, so it doesn't follow. Okay. And then we have 5, ad hominem. So the words ad hominem in Latin mean to the man, and we could refer to that as to the person. So it's a type of logical fallacy where it's a way in which we attack a personal characteristic of a person instead of attacking the problem itself. So in other words, if we're thinking we're attacking the problem, but yet what we're really doing is pulling out some characteristic that we don't like about that person and showing how that's a problem. So therefore, whatever it is that we're looking at as far as the main issue is getting sidetracked by our personal attack. And so the example of that is premise 1, that politician dyes his hair. Premise 2, I don't like people who dye their hair, and therefore he must not be a good politician. So there we're drawing this conclusion about his politics by this fact that he dyes his hair, and so that's a faulty conclusion that he's not a good politician simply because he dyes his hair, he or she dyes their hair. So it's showing you that you're attacking this personal characteristic. And this is, again, amazingly common way of working, whereby we're not usually identifying it as a logical fallacy. And after you see it, you'll start recognizing it in, especially now that we're thinking about politics so much these days. Okay, and then we have 6, which is a false analogy. So this type of fallacy is a suggestion that if we draw a similarity with one argument, thing, or idea, then it must follow with another similar argument, thing, or idea. And so it's referred to as a false analogy. So first premise for our example is ethical relativism sounds similar to Einstein's theory of relativity. Second premise is an ethical relativist denies ethical objectivity. And the conclusion then is Einstein denied objectivity. So there we could see the premises are obviously questionable because you're only connecting the way in which you're understanding relativism in terms of the word itself rather than the concept of what relativism entails. And so we're thinking, well, because I could see that there's a similarity between these words, that must mean that Einstein denies objectivity, which is not true. So again, we're suggesting that the problem really is in the premises, looking at the premises and showing the problematic nature thereof in order to expose this type of thinking as a fallacy, the false analogy fallacy. Then we have the fallacy of equivocation. So this fallacy is understood as a way in which we mistake one thing or idea for another, or we conflate the meaning of one thing or idea into another idea. So the example is one, or A, or the premise is mushrooms are products of nature. Second premise, anything that is natural is good for you. And the conclusion then is all mushrooms are good to eat. And that one's easy to see. In other words, there are poisonous mushrooms, and just because something is natural doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for you. But yet we draw on this way of thinking and have a fallacy in terms of our reasoning thereof. And so also we need to see the next argument is 8, the bandwagon argument. With this type of fallacy, we claim that the importance, value, or truth of something is valuable. With this type of fallacy, we claim that the importance, value, or truth of something is important, valuable, and true because everyone else believes it to be important, valuable, or true. And so in this example, we have only one premise. Everyone I know is a Democrat, and the conclusion then is the Democrats are the best political party. So there we could see, well, wait a minute, just because everyone I know is a Democrat doesn't automatically mean that it is the so-called best political party. So in other words, you're looking at it in terms of popularity. You're drawing your conclusions just because everyone you know is a certain way, so on and so forth. Then we have begging the question, or the begging the question fallacy. With this type of fallacy, we beg the question of truth simply on the grounds that it's true or false, simply because I or someone else believes it's true or false, without any proof or truth or falsity other than the claim itself. So again, you don't have to necessarily be making a claim of truth. You could also be making a claim that something is not true, but at the same time, you could still be conducting a fallacy or committing a fallacy by way of our example should help us bring illustration of how this is understood. So the example is premise 1, I believe the claimed truth of global warming is a hoax. I believe, and the second premise is I believe global warming is a hoax. Therefore, the conclusion, global warming is not a problem and it's false. So there, all we're doing is just because you believe something is true doesn't necessarily mean that it is true. So that's begging the question. And so in that sense, we could see this is a conclusion that people draw quite frequently. Just because I believe something is true doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. Then we have false dichotomy fallacy. So this type of fallacy is characterized as an either-or proposition, without any possibility or other options or choices. So in other words, we just set up this binary relationship and say, well, you have a choice between X and Y, but no other. And oftentimes when we see that type of decision-making process, we could perhaps call it out as a false dichotomy. So a quick conclusion is drawn from a limited number of options, only 2 options. So our example is premise 1, are you an atheist or a Christian? Premise 2, Christianity is a myth about fictitious miracles. And then our conclusion, therefore you should be an atheist. So there we're only looking at 2 options, atheism and Christianity, and drawing a conclusion about how it is that we're seeing or having people believe that you should be an atheist by these faulty conclusions.